How Ibrahim Traoré found a two ocean under the Sahara and changed Africa forever. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. In the searing heat of the Sahel, President Ibrahim Traoré walked through an old, dust-covered research station near Arlit, Niger. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of a European geological expedition that once mapped uranium reserves but abruptly ceased its work in the 1990s. Most assumed the station was irrelevant now, but Traoré had received a mysterious set of documents from a retired African hydrologist, Dr. Salif Diallo. Scribbled on yellowed blueprints was a phrase that ignited curiosity: oceanic anomaly beneath Sahara Layer 2. The idea was absurd, almost mythological. But something in Traoré stirred. What if Africa's greatest resource wasn't being exported, but buried and forgotten? The president's advisors were skeptical. "Your Excellency, we cannot afford distractions," one warned. "We need to focus on agriculture, security, and rebuilding." But Traoré was not a leader who feared the impossible. He knew that the climate crisis, desertification, and foreign exploitation were not separate problems. They were linked by water, or the lack of it. And if there was even the slightest chance that beneath the Sahara's harsh surface lay a hidden freshwater sea, it could mean rebirth not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. "We follow the map," Traoré ordered. "Quietly. No foreign involvement. Not yet." Within weeks, a secret team of African scientists and military engineers was assembled. Using ground-penetrating radar, seismic imaging, and ancient oral knowledge passed down through Tuareg communities, they identified something staggering: two vast underground water bodies extending hundreds of kilometers across the Sahara. The readings were undeniable. These weren't aquifers. They were entire subsurface oceans, trapped under geological plates for millennia. One lay near the Algerian border, the other beneath northern Mali, stretching toward Burkina Faso's northern frontier. "They'll call us liars," whispered one geologist. Traoré replied calmly, "Let them. Then we'll open the earth." The president understood what this discovery meant, and what it threatened. For centuries, Africa had been told it was poor in resources, dependent on Western aid, and doomed to drought. But now, beneath the very sand used as a metaphor for scarcity, was the promise of abundance. The question wasn't whether they could reach it. The question was how long they could keep it secret. "If the world knows too early," Traoré warned, "they will come, not with applause, but with contracts and soldiers." The countdown had begun. The Sahara would no longer be a graveyard of dreams. It would become the cradle of a continent's rebirth. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou under the cover of night, traveling without official escort or motorcade. What he carried in his briefcase could reshape the continent, or trigger a geopolitical storm. Inside were the initial geological readings, thermal scans, and a 6-page handwritten letter from Dr. Salif Diallo, pleading that the discovery not fall into the hands of multinational water corporations. The president convened a clandestine meeting with only 5 people: his science advisor, a trusted military geographer, an environmental historian, a Sahelian tribal elder, and Awa Diarra, his closest strategist. Their mission wasn't just to verify the data. It was to plan for what came next. Control. "Water is peace," said the elder. "But too much of it, to the wrong people, becomes war." Awa nodded. She had seen what had happened to African nations when oil or diamonds were found. Sudden interest, sudden instability. "If we announce this," she warned, "the World Bank will fly in the next day. NATO the next week. Then the pipelines." But the team also understood what this meant for Africa. Clean water, green agriculture, and independence from global food supply chains. It was more than a scientific discovery. It was a key, a way out of centuries of engineered scarcity. "The Sahara will feed us," Traoré whispered, "and it will protect us if we are wise." They drafted what they called the Saharan Protocol, a confidential agreement outlining how the discovery would be gradually confirmed, mapped, and harnessed exclusively by African nations. No external licenses. No private contracts. No IMF strings. To fund the research discreetly, they used gold reserves recently recovered from Europe and rerouted national funds under the guise of solar development. The first dig site was chosen carefully, a remote area near Goram Goram, uninhabited and politically neutral. The drills were disguised as part of an agricultural experiment. Only a dozen engineers knew the truth. The deeper they drilled, the closer they came, and the ground began to sweat. On the seventh night of operations, a sound no one expected echoed through the earth. A deep, distant rumble followed by pressure. The instruments spiked. By dawn, cold mist rose from the borehole like breath from the planet's lungs. The team stood in silence. They had touched the edge of the ocean. It was real. And yet, instead of celebrating, Traoré stood still, staring at the horizon. "Now," he said, "we must become invisible." For beneath their feet was power. And above their heads, satellites watched. The Sahara had opened its mouth, and the world would soon hear its voice. Despite the secrecy, rumors began to swirl. In desert villages, elders spoke of the earth humming at night. Nomadic herders reported seeing strange lights and heavy trucks moving in silence across the dunes. In Timbuktu, a university student posted a blurry image of rising mist with the caption, "The Sahara is breathing." Though quickly deleted, the post spread through encrypted networks. International intelligence agencies took notice. A surveillance drone from an unnamed Western power flew over northern Burkina Faso, capturing anomalous heat signatures, precisely where Traoré's team had begun their second drilling site. The world was sniffing at the edges of a miracle it wasn't meant to control. In Washington, a classified report landed on a senior official's desk titled Saharan Water Disruption: Potential Geopolitical Consequences. It outlined not just the hydrological impact, but the political threat. If validated, this discovery would render West Africa less dependent on international aid, reduce migration pressures, and shift global narratives on African underdevelopment. The response was swift. Diplomatic channels reached out to Burkina Faso, offering development partnerships. A water conglomerate from France offered full infrastructure funding. A Saudi firm sent word of religious stewardship of oasis zones. But Traoré declined every offer. "We are not thirsty for contracts," he told Awa Diarra. "We are thirsty for control." Still, the pressure mounted. The European Commission offered to send independent verification teams. The UN called for a continental hydro-integrity summit. And the African Union, fearing isolation, hesitated to publicly support Traoré's silent revolution. Some neighboring countries, heavily indebted to the IMF, grew nervous. "If you awaken the desert," one West African leader told him privately, "you awaken their armies too." Traoré listened but did not bend. Instead, he accelerated the plan. "We dig deeper," he said. "We show them nothing until we can show them everything, and on our terms." At the second site, the team reached full penetration depth. What they found defied even their most optimistic projections. Not just water, but currents. This wasn't a stagnant reservoir. It flowed. Alive. Ancient. Massive. A blue serpent sleeping beneath stone. Traoré ordered the data sealed and backed up across independent African servers. Only a single physical copy would be stored, inside the presidential palace, guarded not by soldiers, but by 3 women, a hydrologist, a historian, and a girl no older than 12 who had once walked 6 miles daily for water. "This," Traoré told her, "will be your inheritance." And for the first time in generations, the future felt wet with possibility. The pressure to go public had reached its peak. Foreign embassies in Ouagadougou buzzed with speculation. Journalists began appearing in desert towns with long lenses and innocent smiles, asking oddly specific questions. Intelligence analysts debated whether Traoré was hiding mineral wealth, new weapons, or something else entirely. The Sahara, once dismissed as lifeless, was now under quiet surveillance from space. In response, Traoré gathered his core team in a subterranean room beneath the presidential palace. There was no media, no protocol. Just maps, projections, and one impossible choice. Reveal the truth and risk global interference, or remain silent and risk betrayal from within. Awa Diarra was the first to speak. We are running out of time. If they announce it before we do, they will own the story, and the water. Dr. Diallo, now visibly frail but still fierce, nodded in agreement. The world must hear it from us, not about us. But others were cautious. This changes global water politics, said the energy advisor. It could trigger drought pricing wars, food shifts, even sabotage. The silence stretched until Traoré stood. Then we won't make an announcement, he said. We'll create an event. Not for governments. For the people. Awa looked at him. You want a revelation, not a press release. He nodded. Exactly. They chose World Water Day. But instead of calling a press conference, Traoré invited 12 African schoolchildren from 12 different countries to a ceremony near Gorom Gorom. The world watched, confused and curious, as a temporary tent was erected in the sand. No logos. No national flags. Only the word Kanu, water, in Mandinka, painted in blue across the fabric. As cameras streamed the event, the children stood in a circle and placed their hands on a control panel. Moments later, the ground trembled slightly, and from a long pipe deep in the desert, a geyser of crystal-clear water shot skyward, arcing into the sky like a liquid monument. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of children laughing and dancing beneath the spray. Journalists gasped. Scientists scrambled. The world paused. Traoré approached the microphone. For generations, he said, they told us we were cursed with sand. But beneath this sand was not emptiness, it was life. And now we do not ask the world to believe us. We ask it to believe in what we will do next. There was no thunderous applause, just reverence. For the first time in centuries, Africa was not being discovered. It was doing the discovering. And this time, the map was being drawn from within. The footage of children dancing in the desert rain was replayed endlessly on news channels from Al Jazeera to CNN. Commentators tried to spin it. Some called it a PR stunt, others insisted it was CGI, but the scientific community was already buzzing. Hydrologists from Europe and Asia began publishing emergency papers trying to explain the anomaly. Was it a megastructure? A deep aquifer long misidentified? Or something entirely new? But the truth was undeniable. Burkina Faso had tapped into a water system far larger, deeper, and older than anything previously documented, and they had done it alone. Within days, the price of bottled water futures dropped. Agricultural indexes shifted. Nations once dominant in water distribution began to panic. Meanwhile, Traoré refused all invitations to global forums. When asked to address the UN, he sent a video message instead. In it, he stood before the newly flowing desert spring with his sleeves rolled up and said, "Africa's resources are not news. Our independence is." That short speech sent tremors through the World Economic Forum. Secret memos circulated. One leaked, reading, "Traoré is a disruptor. He must be contained." But how do you contain a movement wrapped in children and water? In Africa, something remarkable happened. Countries that hadn't cooperated in decades began forming task forces. Engineers from Ghana traveled to Burkina Faso. Scientists from Ethiopia sent data. Nomads from Niger offered routes across the desert that satellites couldn't see. This wasn't just solidarity, it was strategy. For the first time, Africa wasn't responding to a disaster. It was responding to a blessing. The desert, long viewed as a barrier, was now a bridge. And Traoré made it clear, the water would be shared, but on Africa's terms. No colonial agreements. No extraction licenses. Only Pan-African stewardship. In private, Traoré's team began mapping an even bolder phase. An underground aqueduct stretching across the Sahel, connecting the newly discovered water basins to dry regions from Mauritania to Sudan. They called it the Blue Spine. The technology would be homegrown, the control decentralized, and the goal was not profit. It was permanence. Let them build empires on oil, Awa Diarra said. We'll build civilizations on water. But as the planning advanced, Traoré grew more alert. They will not attack with bombs, he warned. They will attack with doubt, division, and contracts. The battle ahead wasn't under the sand anymore. It was in the shadows. Not all resistance came from outside. Inside Africa, fractures began to form. Leaders of debt-ridden nations, those still tied to international lenders and old colonial contracts, began to question Traoré's intentions. Who made him the voice of the continent? Asked one West African president during a leaked AU call. He risks all our agreements with Europe. Water is not a symbol. It is politics. Traoré knew this well. He wasn't interested in being a savior. He wanted sovereignty. But sovereignty frightened those whose power came from dependency. As one of his aides said, "You didn't just find water, sir. You found their fear." Worse still, an anonymous whistleblower leaked partial documents about the Blue Spine project to a London financial daily. The report spun the aqueduct as a military pipeline disguised as a water system. Western pundits questioned Traoré's motives. Accusations of militarization, nationalism, even desert authoritarianism, filled headlines. Sanctions were quietly discussed in EU chambers. France called for an investigation. But Traoré did not flinch. When they cannot own the source, he told Awa, they try to poison the story. His team countered not with denials, but with more visibility. They released water testing data, open-sourced drill footage, invited African journalists to witness each milestone. At home, however, things grew tense. A small group within the military, loyal to an old elite structure, began organizing dissent. Some felt Traoré was destabilizing the nation with ambitions too grand, too fast. There were whispers of removing him for national security. Awa intercepted messages suggesting foreign embassies had made contact with disaffected officers. Traoré, calm but resolute, called a meeting with his general staff. "If any among you believes water is not worth dying for," he said, "you may leave now. But if you stay, know this. We are no longer fighting for Burkina Faso. We are fighting for what lies beneath all of us." One man walked out. The rest stood taller. That night, Traoré sat alone in his study, staring at a carved wooden bowl once used to collect well water in his childhood village. He placed a single coin inside, one of the last repatriated gold pieces from Europe. "They took gold for water," he murmured. "Now we return water for dignity." As he watched the shadows lengthen on the map before him, he understood that Africa's greatest struggle was never just against poverty, it was against erasure. And now, from the heart of the Sahara, came a stream that refused to disappear. The international backlash escalated swiftly. Major news networks, funded by global interests, began painting Traoré as a destabilizing force. One European anchor warned, this so-called water revolution risks turning the Sahara into the next geopolitical flashpoint. Think tanks issued reports framing Traoré's policies as isolationist, anti-development, or resource hoarding. The irony wasn't lost on Africans who had watched their wealth extracted for centuries. Still, the noise grew louder. Even African diaspora influencers, misinformed and pressured, called for balance in dealing with what they were told was an authoritarian regime blocking progress. Traoré's administration responded not with propaganda, but storytelling. His team launched a continent-wide initiative called the Wells of Truth, broadcasting the voices of local farmers, herders, and mothers whose lives were transformed by the new water access. A child in Mali drinking from a tap for the first time. A grandmother in Niger planting mango trees in once barren soil. A school in Burkina Faso running year-round because they no longer had to fetch water for miles. Let the world hear from them, Traoré instructed. Not from me. Across Africa, cell phones lit up with testimonies, not of ideology, but of dignity. Meanwhile, scientists confirmed what Traoré's team already knew. The underground water systems were not just real, they were ancient, stable, and capable of sustaining regional ecosystems for centuries if managed wisely. The UN hesitated. Western aid agencies scrambled. Water conglomerates, fearing obsolescence, proposed partnership deals, masked in humanitarian language. One particularly bold proposal offered desalination plants in exchange for limited foreign access to the blue spine. Traoré publicly rejected it, stating, "You cannot donate to a well that is already ours." That phrase became a chant, printed on t-shirts, carved into village walls. It was already ours. But beneath the surface, cyber attacks on Burkina Faso's water grid systems intensified. An African cybersecurity firm traced the origin of several to Europe and one to a U.S. military server. Awa Diarra presented the findings to Traoré. "They're not waiting for failure," she said. "They're trying to create it." He looked out the palace window, watching children play in a public fountain for the first time in generations. "Then let them try," he replied. "Because they will never understand this. Water is not just survival here. It is resurrection." And for the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't asking for help. It was asking to be left alone, to rise. As the blue spine expanded, something miraculous began to happen. Not in the desert's depths, but on its surface. Where once there was sand, now there were fields. Villages that had been migrating for decades found reasons to stay. Herds returned to grazing paths lost to drought. Small rivers, long thought extinct, began to flow again as the water table lifted. It was as if the Sahara itself had taken a breath and began to speak. Not in thunder, but in green. Local elders called it the return of the ancestors, a rebirth written not in books, but in roots. International observers, still skeptical, sent drones and satellites to monitor the region. They saw something they couldn't explain: rainfall patterns subtly shifting, localized climate stabilizing, and cloud formations responding to vegetation growth. "The desert is healing itself," one Japanese climatologist whispered during a live panel. Or perhaps, it's being allowed to. Yet while nature rejoiced, political storms brewed. Traoré was now on every Western intelligence watch list. The African Union offered only muted praise, fearful of being labeled complicit in the so-called Saharan nationalism. But the people didn't wait for permission to celebrate. They danced in the fields and named their sons after rivers once buried. Despite the silence of global institutions, a surprising voice spoke up: the Vatican. In a televised address, the Pope praised the divine stewardship of water in Africa, calling it a miracle of human dignity. That endorsement changed everything. Latin American nations, many with colonial scars of their own, reached out. Indigenous communities in Australia and the Amazon began sending ceremonial artifacts in solidarity. It was no longer just an African movement, it was a global reckoning. And yet, Traoré stayed grounded. "This is not about me," he told a group of Burkinabe children. "It's about proving that we were never poor, just unseen." To ensure the movement's survival, he launched the Desert Accord, a transnational pact among 10 African nations to protect the Saharan aquifers with shared sovereignty, rotating leadership, and citizen oversight. No foreign nation could sign. No external body could interfere. It was the first time in modern history that an African treaty was written without European eyes in the room. When the document was signed, not in a capital, but in the sands of Agadez, the pens were made of wood, and the ink from desert berries. A symbolism so quiet, yet so loud. For what had been stolen for centuries was not just water, but the right to write their own future. The closer Traoré came to completing the blue spine, the more violent the pushback became. A fuel shipment meant for water pumps was intercepted at the port of Abidjan under dubious customs claims. International funders blacklisted Burkinabe construction companies, crippling supply chains. Fake news reports flooded African social media, claiming the aquifers were radioactive, cursed, or drying up. Awa Diarra traced these campaigns to a Western PR firm under contract with unnamed, strategic clients. But Traoré didn't retaliate with sanctions or accusations. Instead, he ordered a public tour of the final well, the deepest one, hidden near the border with Mali. They called it the last well, not because it was the final discovery, but because it would mark the beginning of a new era. Unlike the previous sites, this one had no ceremony, no school children, no media. Only locals and elders, the very people who had been dismissed as too rural to matter. They gathered under the starlit sky, watching as the drill hit depth. When the first burst of water erupted, it was warm, rich in minerals, and sweet. An old woman collapsed to her knees, cupping it with trembling hands. "This is not water," she whispered. "It is our memory coming back." The footage of that moment went viral, not because of its production but because of its purity. A single clip, a single face, a single stream of tears and water. It reached beyond politics. Artists in Senegal painted it on alley walls. Poets in South Africa wrote verses around it. African musicians sampled the old woman's voice into protest songs. Even a French news anchor, known for his critical stance, ended a broadcast in silence after showing the footage. His eyes wet. "Perhaps," he said softly, "this is the story we forgot to tell for too long." In the palace that night, Traoré stood before a wall where the names of all the aquifers had been etched by hand. He added one more, Dignite. Beneath it, he wrote no figures, no pressure levels, no data. Just a single sentence. "The well is not the miracle. The people who protected it are." As he put down the chalk, Awa entered with troubling news. International financiers were freezing regional accounts. "They want to suffocate us economically." Traoré simply replied, "Then we teach Africa to breathe again, through its own water and its own will." The final battle would not be over land, but over narrative. Traoré knew this was the final stretch, not just of a project, but of an era. The blue spine was complete, but its real success would be measured not in kilometers of pipeline, but in how deeply the idea took root. And so, instead of expanding outward, he turned inward. He called on every region of Burkina Faso to hold local assemblies. No cameras, no speeches, just people, farmers, teachers, children, drawing their own maps of the future with chalk and sand. "You've seen the water," he said. "Now imagine what we build around it." Those maps, humble and rough, would later be digitized and become the framework for Africa's first open-source development plan written by its people. Meanwhile, a desperate coalition of foreign banks attempted a final blow. In a closed-door G7 session, they proposed a financial embargo on any African nation participating in the Desert Accord. Resource nationalism, they called it. A threat to global market stability. But this time, something was different. Latin America voted against it. India abstained. And, shockingly, a Scandinavian nation walked out. The tide was turning. A global professor at Oxford wrote, Traoré didn't just tap water. He tapped the unspoken fatigue of the world with a system that rewards the thief over the grower. The silence that followed was not weakness. It was reckoning. In Ouagadougou, as the sun rose over the now verdant outskirts, Traoré walked alone to the first well ever drilled, the same one that had first awakened the desert's truth. He knelt, placed his hand into the water, and let it run through his fingers. No gold, no press, just earth and life. Awa joined him, holding a folded piece of paper, the last unopened message from an exiled Burkinabe minister who had once opposed the project. It read, "I was wrong. This was never about water. It was about faith. And you made us believe again. At midday, the people gathered, not for a speech, but for a planting. Every region brought seeds, millet from the Sahel, fruit from the south, medicinal herbs from the mountains. Children placed them into the freshly irrigated soil beside the well. No monument was needed. The land itself would be the memory. As Traoré looked on, he whispered to himself, "We were never lost, just waiting for the rain." And at that very moment, as if history had finally given its blessing, clouds gathered over the Sahara and, for the first time in decades, the desert wept. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.